Okay, so hello everyone. We would like to welcome you to this session and welcome here Professor Maui Hudson, who is an associate professor at the University of Waikato. And Dr. Janet Hamilton Pierce is the program lead of Local Context. The program will be presenting here today. It's a platform that delivers traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. So the floor is yours. You can start. We're looking forward to find out more.
Sure. Well, maybe we'll do a couple introductions first. So, kia ora koutou katoa, mihi ana kia koutou tēnei wā, ko mātātua te waka, ko whakatohe te iwi, ko ngai te matapu, ko Maui Hudson tōku ingoa. So my name is Maui Hudson. I'm a member of the Whakatohea Nation, which is one of the tribes here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as said, I also work at the University of Waikato. And Janet.
Kia ora no tātou, nā mihi atu kia koutou katoa. Thank you, Marina, for touching base with us and all the emails and getting this organised. We really do appreciate it. I te tau tōku mama ko nā te kainuna ki Wairoa te iwi, I te tau tōku papa ko te whanau apanui te iwi, ko Janet Hamilton Pierce ahau. I'm Jeanette at the University of Waikato, the Local Context Program Lead and the Waikato Tainui lands, and in the background of information systems for Indigenous peoples. Really grateful to be here. Thank you. Mātua.
So I'll share some slides. Oh, if someone lets me share my screen, and then sort of run through a little bit of the background. It was really interesting to see that this is about folk medicine, in part because some of the work that I've been involved in the past actually started around working with traditional healers here in New Zealand and thinking about the ways in which they were able to be, I guess, have their knowledge recognised. So. But just to also acknowledge some of the other people that are involved with the Local Context program. So those are the other co-directors, Jane Anderson from New York University, Kim Kristen from Washington State University, who's been heavily involved in the Mercutu platform. I saw that there was a sort of a particular platform which you guys are looking to use in a sort of a digital context. That's the one that she's been involved with helping develop. And then James Francis, who's from the Penobscot Nation, which is a tribe in the state of Maine. I did just need to show off a little bit of the area where I'm from. And Jeanette is just like a little bit further down the coast. So sort of round the corner in the next bay. But this is the area down in New Zealand. And as I mentioned, finding out that the biennial was going to have a focus on folk medicine and phytogeography was really interesting, in part because I was involved with a few different projects that were looking at traditional medicine across the different ways in which it's done, and some of those were, I guess, body work type things, sort of traditional forms of massage. Some of it is working with plants and creating different sorts of things that would be balms or invested, and some of it is also dealing with what you'd call, I guess, the psychological or spiritual elements of a person's well-being as well. So it's a sort of a really interesting element, but it's all of that work is based in traditional knowledge of some sort, and that's the I guess sort of its underpinning foundations and the philosophies and the knowledge that informs the way in which they practice. And so alongside that, I know that there's part of this biennial, this program, is also understanding how you get involved with recording that information and kind of creating archives and setting things up. And so this is just a picture of an app which we've created through our tribe to store our traditional songs. And so our traditional songs are now available on an app. And we're sort of moving towards doing cultural stories and other things. So that sort of process of creating a digital archive and then thinking about how it can be applied to different things is one which we're going through ourselves, but also a number of other communities as well. And our community is also in the process of thinking about how we can apply the traditional knowledge labels onto that material, but also other bits of material as well. And we're doing that as a part of a program which is also about building the digital skills amongst youth and members of our community. So building that kind of digital capacity, and that's what the labels is just one sort of piece of that activity. Finding about how you can make use of platforms, how you can start coding. All of these things are contributing to the things we might be able to produce into the future. But I'm going to go back, well, not back a little bit, sort of, and see if these sort of bounced around these different areas, which either demonstrates that I'm pretty old and been in a bunch of places, or I've just been fortunate to hang out with some smart people. And I think one of the things is, as the world has become more digital and the world has become more digital, is that people have started to think about, well, where are our rights and interests in relation to that material, to that data? And whether it's traditional knowledge or whether it's cultural heritage, as those items have been digitized, it becomes much easier for them to be accessed by people all around the world, and for that knowledge to be appropriated. So sort of, traditionally you would have had to go to a place to see it. Then those things got put into books or put into museums. You still had to go to that place. Now that it's digitized, you don't even have to leave your room. You can just kind of tap a button and see these things. And so thinking about how you would have any kind of control or governance over the way that that data is accessed and used is one thing. And then the other thing about how you can get access to it, because often that knowledge is out there now, but it's not necessarily in the community where it arose. Just as things are going. So there's sort of these two elements that we then focus on around governance. And so that leads into the care principles, and I understand it's one of the focuses as well is thinking about FAIR and CARE, and the FAIR principles in particular, when a group of us that were involved with different Indigenous data sovereignty networks had a look at those, the FAIR principles, realized that they really focus on the data. And so it's all about how the data can be shared and what does the data look like so that it's findable and accessible and interoperable and reusable. But it wasn't really concerned with the people or the purpose, like how that data was being used, for what purpose. And when you look at the sort of principles that Indigenous communities were sort of articulating, they were more about those things. And so that's where they're, thinking about collective benefit, thinking about who has authority, what sorts of responsibilities sit around how that information is used, and the ethics that would inform that use. Those were the things that we thought were missing from from the discussion and the debate. And it's been really interesting as we put forward the CARE principles, that even those members that are a part of the FAIR community and a part of thinking about open science and open data recognize that actually, there's something in that resonates with us as well. And hopefully that sits behind I mean, it's great to see that even in the Western Balkans, that you can see that care has relevance to the sorts of work that you're doing up there as well. So it's been something that started to attract more and more attention, but our challenge now is, how do we actually put that into practice? And the FAIR principles have been in play for a decade or so, and they've started to, talk about this is what it looks like if you're doing it well. And we're just at the beginning stages of trying to think about what does care look like. So, if something emerges from your discussions that kind of points us in that direction, that'd be be really interested to hear what that looks like. And so part of the reason for thinking about where care might, or how care might apply, is that there are all these sort of challenges with the way in which data and information is stored and used. And so you've got these big collections of Indigenous knowledge sitting in archives and museums that in lots of cases, you haven't got the right sort of provenance information. So the names associated with usually the people that collected it, not necessarily the people from the community or the ones that were the stewards of that knowledge in that place. And that means that they're not the legal rights holders. The copyright will sit with a researcher, or sit with an institution. And as these collections are being digitized, any mistakes that are sitting in those physical records now become part of the digital record as well. And it's not just an issue of dealing with what's been collected in the past, but we've got lots of researchers that are doing more work in places, and we're generating data. And if we keep putting it into the same sorts of structures and the same sorts of metadata schema, and don't include this, this sort of information that's important, then we're just exacerbating the problem. And so that's where this, really thinking about rights recognition, can't get in a position where you can be involved in sort of governance of things if you're not able to see or identify the information that should be that you should have a say in. And so, kind of shifting, or not necessarily shifting, but recognizing that there's sort of limitations around how copyright works. That even if you want to move to Creative Commons and things like that, that still requires you to have the copyright in the first place. And then that's just, permissioning it for other people to use. And that's where the labels have come in to try and sit alongside those things and talk about this is where the cultural authority should sit. These people should have a say as well. So that gets us to the traditional knowledge labels themselves, which are really digital tags that help to reflect that cultural authority and give an indication of the protocols for sharing, which the community themselves have. So they can only be applied by the community. There's 20 labels, and they have this, I guess some particular features about them. One, the icon, and the icon remains stable, and so it can be recognized across different jurisdictions and different places. But each of the communities can customize the text that sits with the label. So a label for my community will look the same as a label for Janet's community, but she'll have a different kind of a different set of information that is a description of it. So, the attribution label, which just says, this is who you should recognize when this material is being used. Things that talk, or, the ones here, a cultural sensitive label. Now, all of these labels have emerged from work, essentially which Jane had done, sitting with communities and then talking to her about what what they wanted to express. So what were their, kind of traditional protocols for sharing, and then having a label that reflected those things. And often they're shared across communities, but when there was something that wasn't sort of a protocol that wasn't covered, then a new one would emerge. And so now I think, it's quite a robust set of labels. And then the seasonal one here, which is an interesting one, because there were some bits of information that were only shared at certain times of the year, and with that, that's hard to reflect that in a digital environment. That's something which people do in a person-to-person way. So in that way, the labels are also sort of educative tools. So people seeing it can see, actually, this is how they were used. So here's an example of the traditional knowledge label, or the attribution label. And this is for a community in British Columbia and Canada. And you'll see here that they can use their own language to be a name for that label. And so they've translated the attribution label into name and place. So saying this, we're here and this is our place, and that's what you should recognize. And that's Squixquas Tektomok. And this was, or these labels, or this particular label is being used as a part of a website which that community put together, where they're sharing their knowledge with others, or that other people can see, but they've got labels on that say, this is who we are. It's for a non-commercial use, and it's fine to use for outreach and education purposes. So we have the labels themselves are really doing three different things. Some of the labels speak to provenance, and so this example of attribution, this is who we are, this is who you recognize, and then that has a degree of granularity. So normally we it's been dealt with. I guess what do I mean dealt with? It's been used at a tribal level. I'm not sure what the similar kind of community structure would be in your context, but we often have a tribe, and then you'll have a sort of a sub-tribe or a clan, and then you'll have a family. And so the labels there can also recognize that cultural authority sits with the clan, or the cultural authority sits with a particular family. So, but it's a recognition from the broader community that that responsibility is sitting in those places. And there's also a label that talks about multiple communities. So often some knowledge or particular plants won't just sit in one place, but they'll be across a variety of areas, and can recognize that the multiple communities have an interest in that thing. So provenance is one part, protocols is another one. And so there's traditional protocols for sharing, and often there were restrictions that were in place, and that might have been the seasonal one, which we mentioned before, but often there was gender restrictions, and certainly in not in all communities, but in certain communities where these have arisen from, that was an important feature to reflect things being secret or sacred, culturally sensitive. And in this last section, that's really thinking a little bit more about what sorts of things the community would permission and allow as this material is sitting in these sort of more open spaces. And there's ones here that talk about things being verified or non-verified, that they're open to commercialization, or it's not for commercialization, suitable for outreach. So those are the sort of things that I hope get easily communicated, or people start to recognize and understand as they're used in different places. And so what we just want to share with you is this example, which is probably one of the sort of strongest examples of use that was one of the first ones that I saw, and it was with the Passamaquoddy tribe in the Library of Congress. And so this is Donald Soctomar. He was one of the people from the Passamaquoddy tribe that was involved in this process of working with the Library of Congress. There's the link there to the local a video which we've done on local context, which you can see. It's about 10 minutes long and gives a bit of a sort of history of this particular project, but the general context as well. And it was to do with wax cylinder recordings, and these were the first recordings that we ever made on native tribal lands in the United States. And it was as they were testing the technology. And this is the record that was sitting in the Library of Congress. And you can see from the record itself that there's not much knowledge there. There's sort of information which, you know, the researcher from his context thought were things that he thought were important, and not much about the songs themselves. And so through this process of engagement with the community, with Donald and others, they were able to provide a lot more information. And this is the new record. And sitting behind this is another couple of pages of traditional knowledge that relates to that material, which the community were comfortable bringing forward and making part of the public record, in part because the labels are sitting there. And they say, this belongs to us. It's fine to use for outreach, but not for commercial purposes. The other things that have been done around this too is the way in which the labels have then been recognized in other places. So it's not just sort of the picture you see on this record. They also sit in the rights advisory. So they're actually recognizing that what the community are expressing in this way through the labels is similar to the copyright, which is held by Harvard University. And I think this is something I thought was really, really fascinating, the way in which they could be, even though it's not a legal right, it was being recognized as a cultural right and worthy of recognition. And then alongside this, just the changes that needed to be made within the metadata. So as those records travel to different places, that they can be recognized. So I'm not sure if anyone here is kind of library people. This wasn't my area either, but I'm starting to understand how to talk more and more about MARC fields and JSON files and all this sort of stuff. It's probably stuff that Janet knows way better than me. But one of the cool things about it is they had to create a field for the traditional knowledge labels. So now any item in the Library of Congress could have them attached to it. And so there's another half a dozen communities that are now working on how to apply labels to material that sit in their space. So I see I'm getting down to my last few minutes. So I'll try and kind of get through some of the rest, but I did also want to just show a bit about the biocultural labels, because this is a sort of a tool which we've also put together to think about Indigenous flora and fauna and those genetic resources. So, and I think, in the context of folk medicine, you're often working with plants from particular places, and researchers often want to do work on those folk medicines to find out what are the bioactive components of it, what's special about those medicines. But when they create that scientific data about those things, that goes and sits somewhere else. It often sits in a different place, and communities still feel like they have a relationship with that. It's been generated from their traditional medicine, but a traditional knowledge label isn't the right tool to sit on it, because that's for sharing traditional knowledge. So we've created these biocultural labels so that they can say, here's what we think in relation to this scientific data that's been generated. And, you have things like provenance. So this is a bit like attribution, recognizes it comes from our space. We can verify that we've given consent for this work to take place. we're happy with it being used for research purposes. We're open to collaboration. We're open to commercialization. So it's all kind of geared a little bit more to what those next uses might be and the sort of relationship we might like to have with those things that come about. So here's a little example from my community where we're doing a research project around marine heat waves. It has a whole lot of different components, but the component on the left is a sort of a traditional chant which we have, which identifies sites of significance along our coastline. And then on the right-hand side, you can see along that same coastline, places where they sampled for mussels. And we're interested in the genetic diversity of the mussels. We've got a commercial kind of activities around that, but also a traditional food source. And as they generate scientific data from those sort of mussel analyses, we'll apply biocultural labels there. And then for the traditional chant, we're applying traditional knowledge labels in that context. And these things, they're informing each other in different ways, but how they might be used in other cases is most likely to be separate. So that's how the labels get applied by communities, but we know that that researchers and institutions need to do some bits of work as well. And so their responsibility is to disclose that there are Indigenous rights or interests associated with material which they might be responsible for or have collected. And we've got these different notices that can either indicate that you're open to doing this work, whether it's through recognizing that attribution is complete, or you're open to collaborate, or you can say, actually, we know that there's these traditional knowledge rights or biocultural interests that sit alongside the material. And then I'll just sort of, this series of different examples. I threw this one in because this is actually associated with the bilberry, which is like a blueberry from Scandinavia. And you have the Sami population up there that would have interest in that. And then you can go to our website and see a whole range of different examples where communities have used the labels in digital settings, but they're also using them in sort of physical spaces as well. So as they put exhibitions up, they'll put labels alongside them, or as they create books, they'll add labels to those kind of books as well. And this is an example of a book which has a sort of a digital version as well as the physical book. And then places where notices have been used in different collections of traditional material. Well, that's the sort of ethnography, images. The other one was in the US. This is Canada. There's examples in Australia as well. And I won't kind of go into a lot of this, but I think probably in the questions we might talk about the ways in which it comes about through the local context hub, and that's something which Janet helps us out with. So now we have this picture to show you who you would be getting in touch with, but she's right here. So I just want to say kia ora, and this picture here was painted by James Francis, who's one of the directors as well. So kia ora.
Thank you so much for this inspiring presentation, and thank you for broadening the perspective of intangible and natural heritage. So many great issues that have been addressed here. So also expanding the discourse about rights and interests in the digital sphere of this field. So it was very interesting to hear also about the connection to open science and open data. It is also a connection that from our perspective, we try to approach sharing as citizen enhanced open science in collaborative ways, and also how to establish Indigenous cultural authority in relation to copyrights. I would say that it was very interesting to see the recognition of metadata in this library context that you have presented, since in our case we are trying to create community archives and connect infrastructures with cultural aggregators that collect cultural digitized or digital cultural content. So in this case, we try to create metadata based on the FAIR&CARE principles, but also addressing all this richness that you've created through the labels of provenance of traditional knowledge. Biocultural memory is so great that it can be shared in the metadata context. So thank you again, Maui and Janet, and we can now start with any questions that you may have. Dimitra, Nina, Jelena, and Baiba.
I could talk first. Thank you very much for this super interesting presentation. Really, I didn't know about your work and your practice. And I just wanted to ask, how do you involve the community into the decision of which labels are applied each time? And also, apologies for this, I don't know the scale of the community, of your community that you mentioned in the examples, if you could.
Yeah, so my community is around, well, the community itself is, I'm on the tribal council, there's around 17,000 registered members. But sort of like the primary, only 10% of us live within our sort of traditional area. You know, we've sort of, everyone's moved around New Zealand and around the globe in different ways for different reasons. And the primary sort of town within our area is about 10,000 people. So it's, you know, it's a quite rural, our community is quite a rural one, but New Zealand's quite a small place. So, you know, it's easy to move around. It's been applied by communities of different sizes and scales. But, you know, in New Zealand, we have tribes that might be 1,000 people, but then we have tribes that are 70,000 people. And in other communities, I think we have a sort of a similar sort of scale of where that sits. Usually, what they have though is some sort of formal structure, if that makes sense. You know, a tribal council, an entity that acts on behalf, or a tribal preservation office. And so you've got a tribal council, but then they may have entities. And one of those entities ends up being responsible for applying the labels on behalf of the community. And that entity will do the work with the community, which is often a sort of different sort of consultation, or maybe getting an advisory group together, are the ones that then sit and decide how the label should be customized. And so for what we've had in the past is all of that process, all of that process happened through workshops. So Jane would go to the community, they would do it on, you know, pieces of paper on whiteboards, talk about what it would look like. And I think that's where, you know, it's ended up being really robust from that point of view, because it's sort of, you know, very ground up. These are what these things should be. Now that we're at the point where we're trying to have it be available for more communities, we can't go and talk to everyone. We're trying to shift some of that focus around how that happens onto an online platform, and then provide sort of the necessary support. So when our community first had a look at it, it was during our initial COVID lockdown, and we were able to do it on a Zoom like this, just share screen, show the template text, decide how we wanted to change it around. And so that was the sort of our first time we did it just actually last month, did it again, and it's been a mix of sort of workshops with people in person, but on Zoom as well. And we probably had about 20 people actively participating in that process. And and that was a good group, and was also really interesting because as they learnt about the labels, they started to think about the different places where they might apply them, as they were doing, talking about putting together stories which they would use with kids in curriculum, or we're doing a historical account as part of our treaty settlement process, or the Waiata app. So we've got a range of places where it could be used.
Thank you very much.
Carry on.
Sorry, it freezed a bit. So I just asked if this was a mixed group also in the workshop, or mainly older people, or kind of intergenerational.
No, it was an intergenerational group.
Okay,
so we
great.
had I'm trying to think. Yeah, probably there were actually ended up being a lot of people not quite what the right our age. Our age, yeah.
Yeah, I know.
We had and then there was a few older ones and a couple of younger ones, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitra, for addressing this question with the communities and the community collaboration. This is also the framework that we will be working during our program. So researchers will be connected to the communities, and maybe let's see, we can try to apply the labels. So Jelena and Nina would like to ask any question in the last minutes that you may have.
I also see Baiba raised your hand.
Great,
yeah,
Baiba.
thanks. Yeah, thanks. Luckily I arrived home, and thank you for the presentation and the labels. I didn't know that practice. However, I was wondering of your experience, because there's lots of sharings of the good example when you're doing the workshop and there is a decision of the labels. But I'm wondering of the pitch patches when there is also an issue of deciding what goes on the digital platform. For example, you showed the example of very limited material, and then appeared quite a bit more. I wouldn't say it was heavily loaded with information, but in the decision of when you put the material on the digital platform, what is the, when do you say this is a full stop, and what is the limiting factor that you're not putting everything? So yeah, it's a mix of questions. So we don't have so much time, I guess. So my question would be of the decision of putting the material on the digital platform. How do you decide what goes, what doesn't, except of course, if the community disagree, but there are also sometimes a bit too much information which you're not able. So how do you make the decision in these cases? Yeah, but there are lots more questions, but I guess this decision making, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. So that the decision making is actually one of the things that you're trying to enable through this process. And a lot of times, the example with the Library of Congress was processes where material had been made available, but the community weren't involved in any decision making. So there's a sort of a retrofitting element to some of this. Now, if you're in a position where you're doing it the other way, where you're working with the community to bring forward information and put it in, then you've got these whole series of different sorts of decisions that you can make. And those decisions aren't necessarily ones about the labels. They're ones about whether the content should be there or not. Now, I think in our community, we've got a digital library. That's not necessarily one that's being shared, but we're going to apply the labels to the content in there just for our own purposes. but it means that if we then become comfortable with pushing it onto an open platform, that those things are in place. So the labels have primarily been designed for things that are in an open space, but that doesn't mean, and because the community is the only one that can place the label on it, they agree to what the label is. Whether they get the chance to agree to the content being up there or not is between yourselves or between the institution and them. And what we're hoping is that over time, as the labels are starting to be put in place, that we might be able to affect the way in which the material is made available. And so, there might be a season, if there's a seasonal one, it might not be accessible to everyone at particular times of the year, and it might only be open at other times. So you start to kind of see whether you can operationalize those protocols rather than just being sort of, oh, that's an education thing, that's nice to know, but I'm still going to have a look at it anyway. It's really, the conversations and they come up, it can't all be solved with the labels, but they're one tool that helps with some bits. And then it's really just, I think the one thing about it is when people start using it, they start thinking about that context, and they start then thinking about, issues of intellectual property, issues of data management, all these other things start to become a little bit easier to connect with.
So it gives us a frame. So it becomes a frame where to begin from. Okay. Thanks.
And it can go both ways. I think there's some people have been in that sort of conversation and decide to apply it. Other ones will start with a label and then start to move into these other conversations as well.
Thank you. This is very interesting to know about, and thank you, Baiba, for addressing a question with more critical concerns. So I think that we maybe are now with the 15 minutes of discussion time, right? So maybe a very quick question, since we have been very interested in the metadata of creating communicating the labels in a machine readable way as well. If there are more information to share on this, we would be very happy to know. We see already Janet has shared many links, and we will collect them and put them all together so we can study them.
So there's really two elements in that. One is being able to think about what kind of information can be or should be shared, and what would sit within the metadata. I think whether it's the labels. I mean, we've talked about sort of provenance information being important. That just lets people connect back to things. So what that looks like. Things that talk about protocols and things that talk about permissions. I mean, we've within the labels, we've tried to sort of capture those sort of elements in a way, or at least in a sort of a bit more of a structured way. And I think those things just become important because they support that ability to be involved or involve communities in ongoing discussions about data governance. And so I think that's one part. And then the other part, which we're trying to do through the use of unique identifiers that would then connect notices that get put on particular items or particular projects, and then have that connect to the labels, so that as that information starts to be shared through different places and go from your database into the aggregator over here and then be available somewhere else, that they can also make use of an API to be updated if there's sort of labels that are now being applied by communities and relevant to those things. There's a fair amount of work that communities have to do. So we're trying to have as much labor done by sort of researchers and institutions around changing the information architecture and infrastructures, so that they can then just be saying, this is the labels that we think are appropriate. There's enough work for them to do around the decision-making things Baiba talked about, to then have to try and kind of deal with other institutions and their networks.
Thank you, Maui, and thank you, Janet. The more we learn about your initiative, the more we find out so many ways to, to engage and apply the labels. They're good. Thank you for the elaborated work that you've been doing, and for being here with us. So,
it was fun. I enjoyed it. I hope you had a nice evening.
Thank you all so much also for being here, and this was beyond interesting. And thank you so much for being able to be here at this time, so early for you. I think we have to close our session. Thanks again very much about everything. We will try to implement, if we can, these labels in our project as well. And yeah, hope to see you at some point, maybe also, and talk to you again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
nice evening.
Bye, everyone.
Have a nice
Thank
day,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.